Absolutely. Here's a dramatic and engaging YouTube article on the Pontiac GTO evolution up to 1978, a fourth generation, written without headings and ideal for a cinematic voiceover or narration style. In the roaring age of muscle cars, one name stood above the rest, a symbol of rebellion, raw power, and pure American thunder, the Pontiac GTO. From its birth in the mid-1960s, the GTO didn't just roll off assembly lines, it tore through the streets with a growl that echoed across a generation. But by 1978, the world had changed. The roads were quieter, the engines were smaller, and the golden era of muscle was slipping into memory. Yet the GTO, ever defiant, returned for one more run, a fourth-generation comeback that would divide purists, challenge expectations, and try to carry the torch through a time when horsepower was no longer king. It all began in 1964, when a group of rebellious Pontiac engineers led by John DeLorean snuck a big block V8 into a mid-size Tempest. What they unleashed was more than a car, it was the original muscle car, a 389 cubic inch engine, 3 deuces, and a 4-speed manual that turned a humble coupe into a street legend. The GTO had arrived, and it brought a revolution with it. By the end of the decade, every American manufacturer was scrambling to build a response. Through the late 1960s and into the early 70s, the GTO evolved rapidly. Bigger engines, louder designs, more aggressive performance. This was the muscle car's peak. In 1969, the iconic Judge package was introduced, boasting a Ram Air 3400 engine and an attitude that screamed speed even while standing still. The GTO wasn't just festa, it was a cultural force. It starred in songs, films, and Saturday night races across America. But all empires face a reckoning. By 1973, the signs were clear. Insurance rates were soaring, federal regulations tightened emissions and safety standards. Gas prices spiked, and suddenly, muscle cars were seen as dangerous, irresponsible relics of a fading era. Pontiac, like all automakers, had to adapt. The 1973 GTO, now based on the A-body Le Mans, was heavier and more restrained. It still had power under the hood, but the fire was fading. In 1974, the GTO name was demoted to a trim package on the compact Ventura. It was lighter, more nimble, but lacked the gravitas of the GTOs that had ruled the roads just a few years earlier. The name still had weight, but the soul was harder to find. And then, after that year, the badge was gone. The GTO was no more, or so it seemed. For 4 years, the streets grew silent. The muscle car era was declared dead, replaced by boxy sedans and efficiency-focused engineering. But legends never die quietly. Deep within Pontiac, there were still those who remembered what the GTO stood for. They watched the changing landscape, listened to the grumblings of enthusiasts, and plotted a return. That return came in 1978, and it came in an unexpected form. To understand the fourth-generation GTO, you have to understand the car it was born from, the Pontiac Le Mans. In 1978, the Le Mans was part of the GMG body platform, a mid-size rear-wheel drive chassis shared with several other models. It was lighter than previous years, more angular in design, and fit the mold of the downsized American car of the late 70s. This would be the foundation. Onto this, Pontiac affixed the most sacred badge in its history, a GTO. But this was not the tire-smoking monster of 1969. The 1978 GTO was a product of its time. It was built for a world of emissions limits, fuel economy standards, and tighter budgets. Under the hood was a 5.7-liter, 350 cubic inch V8, a far cry from the high-compression fire breathers of the past. It made modest power by muscle standards, just enough to hint at the legacy it carried. Transmission options were automatic or a 4-speed manual, giving drivers a taste of control. Visually, the 1978 GTO tried to strike a balance. It wore a unique front fascia, featuring dual rectangular headlights, a slotted grille, and subtle badging. The body lines were sharper, reflecting the design trends of the late 70s, with squared fenders and a no-nonsense stance. Inside, it had sport buckets, a rally gauge cluster, and a driver-focused layout that aimed to evoke the feeling of earlier models. It was leaner, more refined but also less aggressive. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Was this really a GTO? Where were the hood scoops, the thunderous idle, the rubber-burning torque? Many purists scoffed, but others saw something else, an effort to bring back a legend in a time that had little room for such things. A glimmer of muscle in a decade defined by compromise. On the street, the 1978 GTO was respectable, not remarkable. It could hold its own in stoplight duels, but it wasn't chasing quarter-mile times anymore. What it offered instead was something subtler, a nod to heritage, a spark of rebellion in an era that seemed to have forgotten what cars could be. For Pontiac, it was a calculated risk, a test. Could nostalgia fuel performance in a world ruled by practicality? The answer came quickly. Sales were lukewarm, enthusiasts were divided, and by 1979, the GTO was gone once again. This time, for what seemed like good, it had re-emerged, flashed its badge, and vanished. The fourth generation lasted just 1 year, a whisper, rather than a roar, but it mattered, because it proved something. The name still had power, the dream still had legs. Even in a time when performance was being regulated out of existence, there were still drivers who remembered what it felt like to be behind the wheel of a GTO, to feel the road tremble beneath them, to hear the engine growl like a wild animal, to live for speed, not spreadsheets. And while 1978 marked the end of the GTO in its original Pontiac form, it planted a seed. It kept the legend alive, and over time, that seed would grow. Decades later, in the early 2000s, Pontiac would look to Australia, to the Holden Monaro, and find the platform it needed to bring the GTO back once more, this time with modern LS power, true rear-wheel drive muscle, and a new generation of believers ready to carry the flag. The 1978 GTO was never the fastest, never the loudest, but it was a survivor. It stood in the middle of a cultural shift and said, "Not yet." It wore the badge with pride, even when the world didn't understand, and in doing so, it bridged the gap between past and future. Today, the fourth generation GTO is a rare sight, overlooked by collectors, misunderstood by casual fans. But for those who know, who truly understand what it means to carry a legacy against all odds, the 1978 GTO is a symbol of resilience, of heritage, and of the undying flame that burns in every true muscle car fan's heart. So when you talk about the GTO, don't stop at 1970. Don't forget what came after the peak. Because the story of the GTO isn't just about Gloria, it's about survival. It's about daring to exist when the world said number. And in that way, the 1978 GTO may be one of the bravest chapters of all. Let me know if you'd like this adapted for narration, split into voice-over scenes, or matched with dramatic visuals.